If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as follow me and subscribe to me on all my other social media platforms. What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with a new thread for you all. I'm starting up this one because I just love talking about old school albums, and I thought, you know what? How about I talk about 90s death metal debut albums, because the 90s was arguably the best decade for death metal. After all, the early 90s was really when death metal was at its highest in popularity, and creativity at this point in the early to mid 90s was very much reached whenever you get all these different subgenres coming up and about, like, you know, death doom, tech death, prog death, blackened death, melodic death, brutal death, slam, traditional death, basically the whole 9 yards, death grind even. Just so much happened in the 90s for death metal. And I know a lot of people like to say that death metal faded into obscurity by the time the late 90s rolled around, which is somewhat true, but at the same time it's extremely hyperbolic, because there were still a bunch of great bands that had debuts in the late 90s heading into the 2000s, which I might do a video like this of the 10 amazing 2000s death metal debuts. That'll probably be next month, more than likely. But I'm talking about the 90s, arguably the best decade of the genre, and I have 10 albums. Now, how I did this, I went with bands that had their first album released between 1990 and 1999. I did not include one-offs, meaning like one album in the 90s and then they broke up, so that's why you will not see bands like Winter or Disincarnate being on this list, because they didn't have enough output after their first and only albums to be qualified. But with that being said, let's get started on the list. Now, I'm going in alphabetical order for this video, but I have 10 death metal debuts, all of them within different subgenres of death metal, and I'm kicking things off with good old-fashioned death doom, and that's Asphyx the Rack. I talked about this album quite a bit during the Asphyx album ranking last summer, and this is a hell of a debut. It's a raw, gritty, nasty, disgusting death doom debut, and, you know, Martin Van Drunen on vocals. This was the first work he did when he joined the band in 1990, 1991, in that time frame. And this was his first effort, and it was for the band's first effort as well, as in terms of a full length. I mean, songs like Vermin, which are very punky and thrashy, and then songs like Ode to a Nameless Grave, The Sickening Dwell, Pages in Blood, and the title track all have oppressive doom nods going on all throughout. There's doom nods all over this album, but also balanced with like a punky thrash attitude in terms of like, hey, we're just gonna do whatever we want. If you don't like it, go fuck yourself. And even the beats get really punky and thrashy quite a bit. Like, even Wasteland of Terror, which is over 2 minutes of just thrashy death metal goodness. But yeah, I went with the Rack because how can you do this without bringing up Asphyx? So yeah, Asphyx the Rack is first. Now we're about to get even more brutal, and that is Broken Hope with Swamped in Gore. I did a retro review of this album, I believe back in 2021 for the 30th anniversary, and after getting a chance to talk to Jeremy Wagner, the only original member left active in Broken Hope, I definitely wanted to include this because this is just such an underrated gem in the early 90s. Like, this came out the same year as another album, well, actually quite a few albums from 1991 I'm going to be bringing up in this list, but this came out the same year as another pillar album in brutal death metal, but we'll get to that one much later. Excuse me. But yeah, with Swamped in Gore, it's almost kind of like a more brutal version of Obituary. Kind of like what would happen if Obituary met Terrorizer and added in much more grossness on top. You pretty much get Broken Hope. Because I bring up Terrorizer because they were a big influence on Jeremy at this point. And there were moments on here where it gets a little bit grindy, kind of like brutal death metal can get. But there's also so much groove, some cool little melodies here and there that remind you of Obituary, but the vocals of Joe Ficek just putrid, low, bleh. Like, they call him the esophagus for a reason, or they did call him the esophagus, may he rest in peace, but songs on here like Bag of Parts, Dismembered Carcass, Devourer of Souls, Awakened by Stench, Goblin to Guts, just amazing, catchy riff writing, ultra low gutturals, really cool drum work, the bass work is really cool, and also, fun fact for trivia, the first death metal album to be recorded digitally. So a little recording nod right there, but yeah, Broken Hope, Swamped in Gore. Next up, we got a bit of an unexpected choice on this list, and once again going back to 1991, and that is Darkthrone's Soulside Journey. Yeah, the only death metal album from Darkthrone, but I included it because it was their debut album. And just, holy shit, this sounds so different from everything Darkthrone would go on to do after this. Whenever this album came out, they already decided to have the mentality to go into becoming more of a leader in black metal. But this is again, similar to Broken Hope, very underrated, because whenever you talk Darkthrone albums, I don't hear this album getting brought up as much. But I still think this is one of the best Darkthrone albums of all time, simply because of how different it is from everything they've done afterwards. I mean, it's almost tech death at times, because some of the riffs get a little technical, even Fenris having some cool technical drum parts, but this almost feels like an amalgamation of Entombed and early Death a little bit. Like, even Nocturno Culto brought up that Death's Scream Bloody Gore was a big influence on him during this time frame, and the solos on this album were heavily inspired by Scream Bloody Gore. But yeah, songs like Cromlech, Sunrise Over Locust Mortis, The Watchtower, Iconoclasm Sweeps, Cappadocia, Sempiternal Sepulchrality, just top to bottom some killer songs, cool riffs, some brutality thrown in there, and like Nocturno's vocals, very punky quite a bit, and this was before he became one of the best screamers in black metal. But yeah, and the bass work, again, from Dag Nilsson, top notch. But yeah, Soulside Journey by Darkthrone. Next up, we talk about an album I talked about at length in my Deicide ranking, and it is the self-titled debut from Deicide. 1990, Roadrunner Records, right in the middle of the Roadrunner death metal gold rush period of like 1989 through about 1994, I would say would be a good estimate, but 1990, this was a hell of an album. Like I've said many times before, my relationship with Deicide is very complicated, because they have some great stuff, but they've shit the bed quite a few times, and I still want more imagination in the lyrics, but that's neither here nor there. But I will say, if you want to know my full opinion about this album, go watch my Deicide album ranking video I did back in November. And I've talked about this album at length. It's memorable for the catchiness and the just sheer evil brutality that this album was able to project into your ears. I mean, songs like Lunatic of God's Creation, Oblivious to Evil, Dead by Dawn, the song Deicide. Again, top to bottom, still in my opinion, the best Deicide album, and it was their first. Returning to 1991, and actually these next two entries, we're going over to Sweden for this. First off, we got from 1991, once again, Dismember, Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. This album, I remember, for so long I was trying to look for a CD copy of this album. Thank God somebody had it in like a CD lot that I was able to buy some of it off of. from eBay and included this. This is a reissue from Willow Tip Records in 2012. I'm hoping Nuclear Blast do reissues of the old Dismember catalog, especially since they're back on Nuclear Blast and about to have a new album come out, which will be fucking fantastic if that comes out this year. But yeah, like an ever-flowing stream, like just 30 plus minutes of just punky, gross, evil, raw HM2 death metal. I mean, songs like Override of the Overture, the opener's fantastic. The song Dismembered, Skinner Alive, Soon to Be Dead. Lots of great D-beat stomps on here, but a lot of thrash going on throughout this whole album. And also, look at the back cover, everybody covered in blood. And it just... this album just screams classic Swedish death metal. But it doesn't quite hold a candle, in my opinion, to the next album I'm going to bring up. And arguably... some people might say the greatest death metal album of all time, and that's Entombed Left Hand Path. I'm going to keep it brief for this because I'm going to be ranking the Entombed albums next week, next Tuesday, so I'm going to try and keep it brief for you. But yeah, this for me is the pillar Swedish death metal album. I don't think anything that's come out in Sweden since this album's come out has even topped this, and I don't think it ever will. Doesn't mean they're going to be bad, they're always going to be great in my opinion, but they gotta play catch-up to this album. But yeah, just quickly, some songs I love, the title track, Drowned, Abnormally Deceased, there you go. But yeah, Entombed Left Hand Path. But back to 1991 once again, and we're talking about a great American contributor, this time from New York. And that's Immolation's Dawn of Possession. Eventually this year, I'm going to be ranking the Immolation albums, and I'll blah blah blah. And I know that the guys over at the Thralls of Metal are going to be ranking Immolation very soon as well. But yeah, this album is just mind-blowing in terms of just how complex and rhythmical it gets. I mean, like, Ross Dolan's growl, it's so recognizable. Granted, it sounds a little different on this album than on the remaining albums in the Immolation discography, but I just love, and I'd say this is the closest I think they get to being a blackened death metal band, because there are a lot of moments on here where you get some like crazy tremolo riffs and black metal blast beats that kind of scream black metal. After this, it's like the black metal elements were used very sparingly after this album, but still, songs like Into Everlasting Fire, the title track, those left behind, I would still say is one of the best Immolation songs of all time. The song Immolation, Fallen Disease, just top to bottom, it's just disgusting and evil sounding and murky. One of the best right here. And kind of in a similar vein to Immolation, we get their just as evil and disgusting brother, and that is Incantation's Onward to Golgotha. I know at some point I'm going to have to rank the Incantation albums. I'll probably end up waiting until after the new one comes out at some point this year. But this album, similar to Dawn of Possession, it's very evil and disgusting sounding, but little more doom-oriented than the Immolation debut. Like songs like the song Golgotha, Rotting Spiritual Embodiment, Unholy Massacre, Profanation, Eternal Torture. Some great doom nods, not as much as they would incorporate going forward. But yeah, this still is just straight up evil, gross death metal. Kind of also even similar to Autopsy at times. It's almost like an amalgamation of Immolation and Autopsy. Like, it has the grossness of Autopsy, but with the evilness of Immolation, I would say. But yeah, top to bottom, another fantastic album out of the New York, New Jersey scene. So yeah, if you haven't listened to this one, or any of these albums for that matter, what are you waiting for? Check them out. Now on to the penultimate album of this video, and that is one that came out at the end of the 90s, 1998. So this is the latest album on this list, and that is Nile Amongst the Catacombs of Neferin Ka. Yeah, 1998, they were on Relapse Records pretty much right from the jump, and holy shit did they show that they're going to become a giant in death metal going forward. Very different from the rest of the discography. Like, this one's more brutal death metal than tech death, even though there's still plenty of technicality on this album, but it would only be starting with Black Seeds of Vengeance whenever they got more technical and a little more melodic, but still maintaining that brutal death metal edge. But this is definitely, in my opinion, the most brutal Nile album, but still has some really cool, like, quirky melodies here and there, like the opening of the song Opening of the Mouth with that, like, flute or whatever it is at the beginning, giving it, like, a nice catchiness before it just gets into just fierce brutality. Other songs like Serpent-Headed Mask, Ramesses, Bringer of War, Stones of Sorrow, which is among one of my favorite Nile songs of all time. It's just so doomy and groovy and just evil sounding. And yeah, fucking absolutely love this album. At some point I'm going to end up ranking the Nile albums. But yeah, don't be surprised if you don't see this in the top 5 of that ranking. But yeah, Nile Amongst the Catacombs of Nefertari. And then last but certainly not least, I brought up Broken Hope earlier in terms of like being a pillar album for brutal death metal. Well, you can't have Broken Hope on a list like this without mentioning their earlier brother, and that is Suffocation's Effigy of the Forgotten. I talked about this album at length during the Suffocation albums rankings that I did back in the late summer, early fall time frame. But yeah, this is still among one of the best death metal debuts, period, and really invented brutal death metal. Especially with that slam breakdown during the midsection of Liege of Inveracity. And yeah, there are other cool slam breakdown parts all throughout the album, but that song gets more credit because it's the opening track. But the title track's killer, Infecting the Crypt, Seeds of the Suffering, Reincarnation, Mass Obliteration, top to bottom perfection for brutal death and even tech death, because it does get quite technical on here as well, and even got like proggy song structures more in just how the songs are put together rather than just like, oh, acoustic guitars and like odd time signatures. No, I'd say prog just because there's no like verse, chorus, bridge going on this album. It's all complex and all just all over the place. But yeah, this is still to this day one of my favorite debuts in all of death metal as a whole. But yeah, definitely check it out if you haven't. And those are 10 amazing 90s death metal debuts. I mean, there were so many other great albums that came out in the 90s that debuted a band. Like even Cannibal Corpse, Eaten Back to Life I could have had on this list. To the Gory End by Cancer I could have had on here. I could have had Into the Grave by Grave. Where No Life Dwells by Unleashed. Let's see, Purification Through Violence by Dying Fetus. I mean, there's quite a few other great debuts that came out in the 90s I could have brought up here, but I feel these 10 all represent different assets of death metal, like traditional death, brutal death, mellow death, death doom, brutal death, tech death, whatever you want to say. But yeah, there's just so many great albums, great debuts for death metal as a whole, not just in the 90s. But I went with the 90s just because, like I said, I feel like, in my opinion, it was the best decade for the genre. Granted, since then, death metal's been doing just fine ever since, but I'd say at some point next month, probably talk about 2000s debuts for death metal, and that will be tough as well. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. If you are watching this video and you make YouTube videos, do a response to this video, talk about your 10 amazing 90s death metal debuts, and let me know, and I will check them out. But until next time, horns high, see you guys later.